She walked into the hospital terrified of a diagnosis, but she walked out fearing something far more dangerous. Him. Ava Sinclair was just a shy bookstore clerk, avoiding attention at all costs. But when Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, a young, brilliant, and irresistibly charming doctor, entered her life, everything changed. What started as a routine checkup became a collision of fate, love, and the battle between fear and destiny. Would she run from him? Or risk everything to stay? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional and unforgettable love stories. Ava Sinclair sat in a hospital waiting room, gripping the sleeves of her sweater so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of distant conversations, the occasional cough, and the rhythmic beeping of unseen monitors. It was an ordinary Tuesday, but for her, it felt like the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. She exhaled shakily, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the woman sitting beside her could hear it. Ava, it's just a routine checkup. Her best friend, Lily, reassured her, her tone gentle but firm. If there's anything wrong, it's better to know early. Ava nodded but couldn't bring herself to reply. She had been postponing this appointment for months, convincing herself that she was fine. But last week, when she had felt a small lump in her breast while getting ready for bed, the breath had been stolen from her lungs. Panic had gripped her so fiercely that she had barely slept since. She hadn't told Lily, hadn't told anyone. Saying it out loud would make it real. But now, sitting here, the reality pressed in on her from all sides. Her stomach twisted as her mind whirled with worst-case scenarios. And yet, the thought that unsettled her most at this moment had nothing to do with the lump. What if the doctor is a man? Ava's voice was barely a whisper, but the fear behind it was deafening. Lily sighed, exasperated. Does it really matter? Ava's eyes widened.
Of course it matters.
Lily gave her a knowing look. Ava, it's his job. You think you're the first shy woman to walk in here. Doctors see hundreds of patients a week. They don't care. But that was the problem. Ava cared. The thought of a stranger, let alone a man, examining her made her stomach churn. She had spent her whole life avoiding attention, avoiding situations that made her feel vulnerable. And now, she was walking straight into one. Before she could spiral further, the nurse appeared in the doorway.
Ava Sinclair?
Her entire body stiffened. Her pulse skyrocketed. Lily nudged her. Go on, she whispered encouragingly. Ava stood on shaky legs, feeling like she was marching toward her doom. The hallway seemed too bright, too narrow, the air too thick to breathe properly. The nurse led her into an examination room, gesturing for her to sit. Dr. Hayes will be with you shortly. The moment the door closed behind her, Ava wrapped her arms around herself. The room smelled overwhelmingly sterile. A standard examination table stood in the center, a medical poster displaying anatomical diagrams of breast tissue hanging on the wall. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting sharp shadows. She squeezed her eyes shut. Just get through this. It's just an appointment. It doesn't mean anything. Then the door opened, and Ava turned, expecting to see an older, no-nonsense doctor who would conduct the exam quickly and efficiently. Instead, she saw him. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes was young, too tall, too strikingly handsome to be standing there in a crisp white coat, looking like something out of a dream. Or a nightmare. His deep blue eyes held a calm intelligence, his neatly styled dark brown hair complementing the sharp angles of his jawline. His presence radiated quiet confidence, the kind that suggested he was used to being in control of every situation he stepped into. Ava's face flamed red instantly. This was the worst possible outcome. "Good afternoon, Miss Sinclair," he greeted her with a warm, professional smile, his voice smooth and even. "I'm Dr. Hayes. I'll be conducting your examination today." Ava couldn't speak. Her throat felt dry, her heart hammering against her ribs. She forced herself to look at the floor, convinced that if she met his gaze for too long, she might actually pass out. Dr. Hayes immediately noticed her hesitancy. He had seen nervous patients before, but something about her was different. She wasn't just uneasy. She looked like she wanted to bolt. "Miss Sinclair," he said gently, taking a step closer. "I understand that medical exams can be uncomfortable, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make this as easy for you as possible." Ava clenched her fists. I just... His expression softened. "Would you feel more comfortable if a nurse stayed in the room?" Ava hesitated. That would probably make it worse. She shook her head quickly. "All right," he nodded, completely unfazed. "I'll explain everything before we start so you know exactly what to expect." She swallowed hard and nodded, still refusing to look at him directly. Dr. Hayes took a seat at his desk, pulling up her file. "First, I need to ask you a few routine questions." Ava barely processed what he was saying. She answered in short, awkward sentences, keeping her gaze fixed on the edge of the table. Dr. Hayes, ever perceptive, caught on. After a brief pause, a trace of amusement flickered in his voice. "Miss Sinclair, you don't have to be so nervous. I promise I don't bite." Ava's head snapped up, startled by his lighthearted tone. He gave her a reassuring smile, and for the first time since stepping into the hospital, she felt the smallest sliver of relief. But that relief vanished instantly when he asked her to lie back on the examination table. Her entire body tensed. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. And as Dr. Nathaniel Hayes reached for his gloves, his gaze steady and reassuring, Ava realized that this appointment wasn't just about a medical checkup. It was about facing something much bigger. Her fears, her insecurities, and perhaps something else she wasn't ready to admit. Ava lay stiffly on the examination table, every muscle in her body locked in place. The cool gel against her skin sent a shiver down her spine, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming anxiety twisting in her stomach. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, as Dr. Nathaniel Hayes moved with calm precision. "Try to relax," he said gently. "I'll be as quick as possible." Relax. As if that was even remotely possible. She tried to focus on anything other than what was happening. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint murmur of voices outside the room, the sterile scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. But none of it helped. Because she knew what he was looking for. What she had feared ever since she found that small, foreign lump beneath her skin. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms, counting the seconds in her head. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she felt him still. Ava's eyes snapped open. Dr. Hayes was staring at the monitor, his brow furrowing slightly, his usually composed expression shifting into something more focused. His silence sent a bolt of cold fear straight through her chest. "Wow," she blurted out, her voice sharper than intended. Dr. Hayes looked at her then, his blue eyes steady, unreadable. Ava's entire body went numb. The words rang in her head like a distant echo. "Found something." Her fingers trembled against the fabric of her sweater, her throat tightening so much she could barely breathe.
What?
Dr. Hayes set the probe aside, and rolled his stool closer to her, maintaining that maddeningly calm demeanor, as if what he had just said hadn't just shattered the ground beneath her feet. "There's a small lump in your breast," he explained, his voice even but careful. "It appears to be benign, likely a fibroadenoma, which is a common, non-cancerous growth in young women. Benign, not cancerous. Likely." The words tumbled through Ava's mind, but they didn't settle. They didn't ease the icy grip of fear coiling around her ribs. She swallowed hard. "You're sure?" "I'm fairly confident," he said, his tone reassuring. "But I'd like to schedule a follow-up in 2 weeks to monitor it, just to be safe." Ava barely heard him. Her heart was pounding so violently, she could feel it in her throat. She should have been relieved. He'd said benign. He'd said it wasn't serious. But none of it mattered, because the moment he had said the words "found something," all she could think about was her mother. Her mother's tired, sunken eyes. The way her once vibrant laugh had faded into weak smiles, then silence. The smell of antiseptic and hospital sheets that had become so familiar near the end. The sound of her father's voice breaking as he told Ava the treatment hadn't worked. She'd been 14, and she had never stopped being afraid since. Dr. Hayes must have noticed the panic on her face because his voice softened. "Ava," he said, and the way he said her name pulled her back, grounding her, if only for a moment. "I need you to breathe." She inhaled sharply, realizing she had been holding her breath. Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "Listen, I know this sounds scary, but I need you to trust me. Based on what I'm seeing, this doesn't look like anything alarming. Fibroadenomas are harmless in most cases. But I want to be thorough." Ava's lips parted, but no words came out. Her mind was too tangled with memories, with fear, with the endless possibilities of what if. Dr. Hayes watched her carefully. "Has anyone in your family had breast cancer?" Ava's fingers curled into the thin paper sheet covering the table. "My mom." The words barely made it past her lips. She didn't make it. Dr. Hayes exhaled quietly, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "I see." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. "I get why this is terrifying for you," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, steadier, as if he knew exactly what kind of fear he was dealing with. "But I need you to remember that your case is different. Just because your mother had breast cancer doesn't mean this is the same situation." Ava swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes stinging. "You don't know that." Dr. Hayes didn't argue. He didn't feed her false reassurances. Instead, he reached for a notepad and scribbled something down. "I'm scheduling you for an ultrasound in 2 weeks," he said. "That'll give us a clearer image of the mass. If necessary, we may do a fine needle aspiration, a small biopsy to test the tissue." Biopsy. The word hit her like a slap. Dr. Hayes must have seen the terror flash across her face because his next words were firm but gentle. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The ultrasound will tell us a lot, and there's a very high chance that no further testing will be needed." Ava barely nodded, her pulse still erratic. Dr. Hayes handed her a slip of paper. "In the meantime, if you have any concerns, don't hesitate to call." Ava took it with trembling fingers, staring at the words printed on the page without really seeing them. She stood on shaky legs, her world tilting beneath her feet. When she walked out of the room, she felt different than when she had entered. Before, she had feared embarrassment. Now, she feared something much worse. Ava pushed open the door to the small bookstore cafe, the familiar scent of coffee and paper wrapping around her like a warm embrace. It should have been comforting. Normally, this was her favorite place in the world, her sanctuary from the chaos outside. But today, nothing felt normal. Her fingers were still trembling as she adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. It had been hours since she left the hospital, but the weight of Dr. Hayes' words still clung to her. There's a small lump, likely benign. We'll monitor it. Likely. That word had latched onto her brain, refusing to let go. It wasn't a certainty. It wasn't a certainty. It wasn't a guarantee. And for someone like Ava, who had spent the past decade fearing that history would repeat itself, life wasn't enough. She sucked in a deep breath, pushing down the rising panic. She just needed a distraction. A few quiet minutes before her shift started, a cup of tea, maybe flipping through the pages of an old book, anything to keep her mind from spiraling. She scanned the room, searching for an empty table, when her breath suddenly caught in her throat. Sitting by the window, casually stirring his coffee, was Dr. Nathaniel Hayes. Ava froze. No. This wasn't happening. She should turn around, leave, pretend she never walked in. But before she could even move, he looked up. Their eyes met. For a split second, Nate seemed just as surprised as she was. Then, to her absolute horror, his lips curled into a slow, easy smile. "Ava," he greeted, his voice warm, carrying across the cafe effortlessly. Her pulse skyrocketed. Why was he here? This wasn't his hospital. This wasn't his world. She forced an awkward smile, shifting her weight from foot to foot.
Hi, Dr. Hayes.
Nate stood, his towering presence making her feel even smaller than usual. What a coincidence, he said. Then his sharp gaze flickered downward, landing on the small name tag pinned to her cardigan. His smile widened.
Wait, you work here?
Ava swallowed. Yeah, part-time. Something about that amused him. Huh, he mused, tilting his head slightly. I was wondering why this place looked familiar. A friend recommended it to me. And now it turns out my patient works here too. Great. Just great. She needed an escape. Now. Well, I should... Ava. Her manager's voice cut through the air. She winced. You don't start for another 15 minutes, right? Betrayal. Absolute betrayal. Before she could deny it, Nate lifted an eyebrow, looking far too pleased. That means you have time, he pointed out. Then, as if he hadn't just completely dismantled her plans of escape, he gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Why don't you sit for a minute? Ava hesitated. Every instinct screamed, run. But Nate was watching her, calm, patient, waiting. And the truth was, she didn't have the energy to fight today. Reluctantly, she shuffled forward and slid into the chair, mentally berating herself for not running when she had the chance. Before she could even decide what to say, Nate pushed a second cup of coffee toward her. I ordered an extra, he said casually. Hope you like caramel macchiatos. Ava blinked, startled. How did you... He smirked. Lucky guess. She hesitated before wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. She wasn't used to people paying attention to her preferences. Nate leaned back completely at ease, while she felt like a bundle of nerves. So, he said, studying her, you work at a bookstore cafe. That suits you. Ava tilted her head.
What's that supposed to mean?
He chuckled. You seem like someone who loves books. Quiet, thoughtful, always lost in your own world. Ava flushed. I'm not always lost in my own world. Nate raised an eyebrow. Really? You barely looked at me during your appointment. Ava choked on her coffee. Nate grinned. Relax. I'm just teasing. She glared at him, but there was no real heat behind it. Instead, to her absolute horror, she found herself smiling. Nate took a sip of his coffee. So, what kind of books do you like? That question, the simplest question, immediately melted some of her nerves. Her eyes lit up. Oh, well, I love classic literature. Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Hemingway. But I also enjoy fantasy and historical fiction. Something about escaping into different worlds just feel. Nate nodded, as if he truly understood. Safe, huh? Makes sense. Reality can be overwhelming sometimes. Ava glanced at him, surprised. You read? Nate laughed.
What? Doctors aren't allowed to enjoy books?
She bit her lip, suddenly embarrassed. No, I just didn't expect it. His smirk deepened. I'm full of surprises. Something about the way he said it, the playfulness in his tone, the glint in his eyes, made her stomach flip. She quickly took another sip of coffee to compose herself. The minutes slipped by faster than she expected. Talking to him wasn't as terrifying as she had imagined. He listened intently, occasionally asking thoughtful questions, showing a genuine curiosity that caught her off guard. He wasn't just polite. He was engaged. For the first time, she wasn't just thinking of him as Dr. Hayes. He felt real, human, and far too charming for her own good. Just as she was beginning to forget her usual shyness, her manager's voice called out, Ava, time to clock in. She startled, nearly knocking over her cup. Oh, right. Nate nodded, an amused look in his eyes. Of course, as she stood, she hesitated, debating whether she should say something else. But before she could overthink it, Nate beat her to it. Ava, he said, his voice softer now. She turned back to him. Take care of yourself, all right? His expression was serious now. No teasing, no playfulness. Just quiet concern. Her throat tightened. She gave a small nod. Yeah. See you at the follow-up. And before she completely lost control of her rapidly beating heart, she turned and hurried behind the counter, fully aware of Nate's gaze still on her as she walked away. Ava told herself that Nate's visit to the cafe had been nothing more than a coincidence, a strange, awkward, completely unexpected coincidence. Nothing more. But then he came back. The next afternoon, she was shelving books near the register when the bell above the door chimed. She glanced up, not thinking much of it, until she saw him. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes. Again. Ava nearly dropped the book in her hands. Nate strolled in like he belonged there, dressed casually this time. No pristine white coat, no air of clinical professionalism. Just a dark sweater and jeans, his sleeves pushed up slightly, revealing strong forearms. His hair was slightly tousled, like he had run his fingers through it a few too many times. He looked ridiculously good. And he was walking straight toward her. Ava's heart kicked into overdrive. No. Nope. Not happening. She turned sharply, pretending to focus on the book display, as if she could somehow become invisible if she ignored him hard enough. Ava. Ava. Too late. She plastered on what she hoped was a neutral expression before slowly turning to face him. Dr. Hayes, she greeted, her voice carefully even. He smirked. It's just Nate. She refused to acknowledge the way that made her stomach flutter. Are you lost, Nate? His smirk widened. No, I'm exactly where I want to be. Her face burned. You don't have patience to see? I do. He shoved his hands into his pockets. But I'm on break. Ava narrowed her eyes. And you just happened to end up here? He tilted his head, pretending to consider. I did say I liked the coffee. Ava folded her arms.
You drink hospital coffee every day. And you're telling me this cafe's coffee is so good it's worth a daily visit.
His expression didn't change. Yep. She stared at him. He stared right back. Neither of them spoke. Ava's pulse roared in her ears. What is he doing? Finally, Nate broke the silence. Are you going to stand there interrogating me, or are you going to help me find a book? She blinked. What? He gestured toward the shelves.
This is a bookstore, right?
Her lips parted. Was he seriously going to pretend like he wasn't here just to mess with her? But before she could call him out on it, he added, I need a recommendation. Ava hesitated. This is fine. This is normal. This is literally my job. She sighed and motioned for him to follow. What kind of book are you looking for? He fell into step beside her, his presence frustratingly comfortable. Something good. She rolled her eyes. That's not helpful. I like a challenge. She shot him a pointed look. You're impossible. And yet, you haven't walked away. Her mouth snapped shut. Nate chuckled, clearly enjoying himself, and Ava bit back a sigh as she pulled a book from the shelf. Here, she said, shoving it into his hands. Try this. He examined the cover. The Night Circus. She nodded. It's beautifully written. Dreamy, magical, a little mysterious. I think you'd like it. He studied her instead of the book. And why's that? Ava hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it, but Nate felt like someone who would appreciate the way words could transport a person, the way stories could create entire worlds to get lost in. Instead, she shrugged. Just a feeling. Nate watched her for a long moment before surprising her completely. He handed her the book back. Pick another. Ava blinked. Why? Because I trust your judgment. She didn't know why that made her chest tighten. For the next few minutes, Ava pulled out book after book, suggesting a mix of genres. Literary fiction, historical drama, even a medical memoir, just to tease him. And to her surprise, he actually listened. He didn't just nod along or pretend to care. He asked thoughtful questions, flipped through pages, engaged with her in a way that most customers didn't. And Ava, against her better judgment, started to relax. For a little while, she forgot about the appointment, the tests, the looming uncertainty in the back of her mind. It was just easy. Too easy. Which was why, when Nate finally made his selections and stepped toward the register, Ava immediately built her walls back up. Because this was dangerous. She wouldn't, let herself feel comfortable around him. So when he smiled at her after paying, when he said, "See you tomorrow," with absolute certainty, Ava forced herself to shake her head. You don't have to keep coming here, she said, trying to sound casual. I mean, you're a busy doctor. I'm sure there are a million other places you could be. Nate didn't blink. Maybe. Then, with a smirk, he added, "But I like it here." Her breath caught. He liked it here. And somehow, she knew he wasn't just talking about the cafe. Ava had no idea what to do with that. So she did the only thing she could. She looked away, muttered a quick, "Enjoy your books," and fled behind the counter. She didn't look back. But she felt his eyes on her anyway. Ava sat curled up on her bed that night, her laptop balanced on her knees, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the storm of emotions on her face. She had tried to ignore it. She had told herself that Nathaniel Hayes was just a doctor. Just a man. Just someone doing his job. But that wasn't true, was it? Because no ordinary doctor showed up at her workplace multiple times in a week. No ordinary doctor looked at her like he was genuinely interested, like she was more than just another patient on his list. And no ordinary doctor made her feel like this. She let out a frustrated breath, pushing her fingers through her hair. This is ridiculous. Still, she typed his name into the search bar before she could stop herself. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes. The results loaded instantly. The first thing she noticed was an official profile from the hospital, a straightforward professional biography detailing his impressive career. But then she scrolled further, and her stomach dropped. Hayes Medical Group, the future of private healthcare. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, only son of billionaire philanthropist Robert Hayes, chooses a different path. The reluctant heir. Why the next, in line to a billion-dollar empire, chose to be a doctor instead? Ava clicked the article, her fingers trembling. The words blurred together as she scanned them. Nathaniel Hayes, heir to the multi-billion-dollar Hayes Medical Group, has chosen to step away from corporate leadership in favor of practicing medicine. While his family remains deeply involved in the healthcare industry, Dr. Hayes has focused his efforts on patient care, particularly in advancing early detection programs for breast cancer and other life-threatening illnesses.
She stopped reading.
Her breath came in uneven bursts. Nate was billionaire. A billionaire. It all made sense now. The effortless confidence, the way he carried himself, the way he never seemed rattled by anything. She had known he was successful, but this was another world entirely. And she was just her, a shy girl working at a bookstore. A girl who had spent her life feeling small, insignificant. A girl who still hesitated to order her own coffee because talking to strangers made her anxious. Her chest tightened. She had actually started to feel comfortable around him. She had let herself believe, for a second, that maybe, just maybe, whatever was happening between them was real. But it wasn't. It couldn't be, because men like him didn't end up with women like her. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. How stupid had she been? She shut the laptop with a little too much force, her mind already made up. She couldn't see him again, not like before. She would go to her follow-up appointment, because she had to, but that would be it. No more conversations over coffee. No more book recommendations. No more pretending that she belonged in his world. She grabbed her phone, heart hammering in her chest, and pulled up her messages. Nate had texted her earlier that day. Nate, you looked less stressed today. That's a good sign. Nate, don't forget. Follow up next week. I'll be there. And yes, I'll still be drinking your cafe's overpriced coffee. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then, slowly, she turned the phone over, screen, down, as if ignoring it would make it all disappear. She had to end this before she made a fool of herself. And the only way to do that was to walk away first. The next morning, Ava called the hospital. I need to cancel my follow-up appointment, she said, gripping the counter tightly. Would you like to reschedule for a later date? The receptionist asked. Ava hesitated. No, I'm fine. I don't need it. There was a pause. Dr. Hayes specifically noted that he wanted you to follow up. I'm fine, she cut in, her voice tighter than she meant for it to be. Please cancel it. The receptionist hesitated, then finally sighed. All right. I'll make a note. Ava barely muttered a thank you before hanging up, her hands shaking. It was done. She wouldn't see him again. It was for the best. So why did it feel like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life? Nate frowned at his phone, irritation flickering across his features. No reply. Again. He had sent Ava 2 texts since yesterday. Casual ones, nothing too forward. But she hadn't responded. That was unusual. And then, just as he was debating whether to call, his assistant knocked on the door to his office. "Dr. Hayes?" He looked up. "Yeah?" "Your patient, Ava Sinclair. She canceled her follow-up." His stomach dropped. "What? What?" "She called this morning, said she didn't need it anymore." That wasn't right. That wasn't Ava. Nate stood, his mind already racing. Something had changed. Something had scared her off. And if she thought he was going to let this go that easily, she was dead wrong. The bell above the bookstore door chimed, and Ava barely looked up from where she was restocking a shelf. The store was quiet this evening, only a few customers browsing, and she had been grateful for the solitude, until she heard his voice. "Ava." Her entire body stiffened. Slowly, heart-pounding, she turned, and there he was. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes. Still in his work attire, his coat draped over his arm, his shirt sleeves pushed up just slightly. His expression was unreadable, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Ava swallowed hard, fingers curling into the book she was holding. "Nate." His gaze flickered slightly at the way she said his name, cautious, distant, like he was a stranger now. "Are you avoiding me?" he asked outright. Ava's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Nate stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You missed your follow-up," he said, his voice calm, measured, but there was something beneath it, something firm. "You didn't answer my calls, and now you're acting like I don't exist." She forced a small, awkward laugh, looking away. "I've just been busy." "Busy?" His jaw tightened. "That's the excuse you're going with?" Ava felt trapped, her hands tightening around the book in her grip. "Nate, I feel fine. There was no reason for me to come back. That wasn't your call to make." His voice was quiet, but it sent a jolt through her. Her head snapped up.
Excuse me?
His eyes burned into hers. "You didn't even let me confirm that you're fine. You just disappeared." Ava's stomach twisted. "I didn't disappear," she muttered. Nate exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Then what is this, Ava?" His voice softened, but there was frustration laced in his tone. "Why are you shutting me out?" Ava's fingers curled tighter around the book. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stand here, in this tiny bookstore, beneath the weight of his gaze, and pretend she wasn't drowning in emotions she had no idea how to deal with. So she did the only thing she could. She lied. "I just think it's best if we don't see each other anymore." Nate stilled. Something flickered in his expression. Shock, maybe, or something deeper. Then realization dawned in his eyes. "You found out." Ava's breath caught. "You know who I am," he said quietly. "That's why you're doing this." Her chest ached. "It doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it?" She swallowed, looking away. "You're the heir to a billion-dollar empire, Nate. And I'm just me." His gaze darkened. "And who decided that makes a difference?" A bitter laugh slipped from her lips. "Reality." Nate exhaled sharply. "Ava, if you think for 1 second that I care about my last name more than I care about you..." She cut him off. "It's not just about you." The words spilled out before she could stop them, her voice cracking slightly. "You live in a world of wealth and success, and God, Nate, you belong at galas, shaking hands with CEOs, making billion-dollar deals, not drinking overpriced coffee in some hole. In, Wall bookstore cafe with someone like me. She hated how raw her voice sounded, how vulnerable she felt standing in front of him like this. Nate was silent for a long moment. Then, in one slow step, he closed the space between them. She felt his warmth, his presence overwhelming, suffocating in the best and worst way. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but unshakable. "You think I care about any of that?" Ava's breath stalled. "You think I see you as just anything?" he murmured, his tone so low it sent shivers down her spine. She had no answer. Because the way he was looking at her right now, the way his eyes held hers like she was the only thing that mattered, made it clear. He wasn't going to let her go. A lump formed in her throat. "Nate, don't," he whispered. She sucked in a breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I don't care about money," he said softly. "I don't care about my last name. The only thing I care about right now," he exhaled sharply, his eyes never leaving hers, "is why the hell you think I'd let you push me away so easily." Her hands trembled. She had expected anger, maybe even frustration. But not this. Not this quiet determination. Not this absolute refusal to let her go. Her lips parted, her emotions unraveling faster than she could control.
Nate,
Ava breaks over. The voice snapped through the moment like a whip. Ava inhaled sharply, stepping back, her heart racing. Her manager. Reality crashed back in. Nate clenched his jaw, but slowly nodded. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. But before she could turn away, his voice came again, low, steady, a promise. "This isn't over, Ava." Her chest tightened.
She knew it wasn't.
Ava's hands clenched around the strap of her purse as she walked down the too bright hallway of the hospital. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, and her heart pounded with every step she took toward his office. It had been a week since their confrontation at the bookstore. A week since she had tried to push him away, only for Nate to refuse to let her go so easily. And despite everything, despite her fears, despite the walls she had desperately tried to rebuild, here she was. She told herself she was here because she had to be. The lump still existed, still sat beneath her skin like a quiet threat, and regardless of how much she wanted to avoid him, she couldn't avoid this. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just the appointment that had brought her back. She reached his office door just as a nurse called her name. "Miss Sinclair, Dr. Hayes is ready for you." Ava forced herself to breathe. "It's just a checkup. It's just Nate." She stepped inside. Nate was at his desk, reviewing a file on his monitor, his expression unreadable. But the moment he looked up and saw her, something shifted. "Ava," he said, standing. His voice was steady, but there was something else in it. Something restrained. She swallowed. "Hi." For a long, quiet second, they just looked at each other. And then, just as quickly, he schooled his expression back into something neutral, professional. "Right on time," he said, motioning to the examination table. "Let's get started." Ava hesitated for only a moment before moving toward it, feeling ridiculously self-conscious. She lay back stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of the paper-covered cushion. Nate adjusted the ultrasound machine, his movements efficient, precise. "I'll apply it'll gel," he murmured. "It's cold." She barely had time to brace herself before the cool sensation touched her skin. She flinched. "Sorry," he said immediately, his voice softer now. "I'll warm it up next time." Ava's breath hitched. Next time. She didn't know why those words made her stomach twist. He was so careful, his touch light, professional, nothing inappropriate. Yet the simple fact that it was him made her pulse race. Minutes passed in silence as he worked, his eyes locked on the monitor. Ava couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell what he was seeing. Finally, she whispered, "What do you see?" Nate's eyes flickered to hers before he answered. "Nothing alarming," he said, his voice firm, reassuring. "The mass is exactly as I expected. A fibroadenoma. No signs of malignancy." Ava's breath rushed out of her lungs all at once. "So, I'm okay?" Nate's lips curved slightly. "You're okay." Relief crashed into her so suddenly that her muscles finally relaxed. For weeks, she had prepared for the worst, let the fear sink into her bones. But now she was okay. She closed her eyes briefly, her head sinking against the cushion. Nate let her have a moment before continuing, his voice gentle. "We have two options moving forward," he said. "We can monitor it every 6 months to ensure it doesn't grow or change. Or," she opened her eyes, "or, if it bothers you, mentally or physically, we can remove it," he explained. "It's a simple outpatient procedure. Quick recovery, minimal scarring." Ava hesitated. "What do you think I should do?" Nate studied her for a second before replying. "Medically, there's no urgent need for removal. But if the idea of having it causes you stress, then taking it out might be the better choice." Ava bit her lip.
How was she supposed to decide something like this?
"I need to think about it," she admitted. Nate nodded. "Take your time." She exhaled slowly, trying to process everything. And then it happened. Ava sat up, still slightly dazed from the overwhelming relief. But as she moved to stand, her foot caught on the fabric of her sweater. She lost her balance. And before she could react, before she could stop it, she fell. Straight into Nate. Her hands instinctively grabbed onto his shirt, his arms wrapped around her, steadying her before she could hit the ground. Time stopped. Ava froze. Her face was mere inches from his chest, her hands gripping the crisp fabric of his dress shirt. His fingers were firm against her waist, holding her up effortlessly. And suddenly, she was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of him. The scent of his cologne, clean, subtle, dangerously intoxicating. The way his heart was beating just as fast as hers. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. Then, she yanked herself away so fast she nearly stumbled again. I'm so sorry." Nate, however, looked completely calm. If he was surprised, he hid it remarkably well. His lips curved slightly. "Are you okay?" Ava wanted to disappear. "Yeah," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "Totally fine. No problem. Nothing to see here." Nate tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You... sure." Her head snapped up. "I am not flustered." He just looked at her. Ava clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. "Nope. Absolutely not." Nate thankfully didn't push further. Instead, he handed her a small folder. "Here's all the information on both options. Take your time deciding." She snatched it up, nodding quickly. "Okay, yep, got it, thanks, bye." And before she could do anything else humiliating, she practically sprinted out the door. Nate watched as she disappeared down the hall. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. Ava Sinclair was unlike any patient he had ever met, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, she intrigued him more than she should. Ava stared at the message on her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as if answering would somehow change the course of reality. Nate, come to the gala with me. The words were simple, but the weight behind them felt anything but. She had read the text at least 10 times, expecting her mind to suddenly make sense of it, to find some logical explanation for why he was asking her. Of all people, to accompany him to a charity gala filled with the wealthiest people in the city. It had to be a joke. Except she knew Nate didn't joke about things like this. She sighed, tossing her phone onto her bed before pacing the small space of her apartment. Saying yes would be a mistake. A huge one. She had already decided to keep her distance, to let whatever was happening between them fade before it could become real. And yet, her phone buzzed again. Nate, I know you're overthinking. Just say yes. Ava groaned, running a hand through her hair. Damn him. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and typed a single word. Ava, fine. She hit send before she could change her mind. The night of the gala arrived faster than Ava was prepared for. She stood in front of her mirror, her fingers smoothing over the deep green fabric of her dress. It was borrowed. Her sister, Grace, had insisted on helping her find something suitable after Ava had made the mistake of telling her where she was going. Do you even know what kind of event this is? Grace had said, shoving dresses at her. A billionaire charity gala? Ava, these people don't just wear dresses, they wear statements. Ava had rolled her eyes at the time, but now, as she stood in the elegant gown, she felt like an imposter. The soft knock at her door made her stomach tighten. She opened it to find Nate standing there. And for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. He was in a tuxedo, not just wearing one, but owning it. The black fabric fitting perfectly over broad shoulders, his usually tousled hair neatly styled, a sharp contrast to the man she'd seen in Scrubs. His gaze swept over her, and something flickered in his eyes. Something quiet, but undeniable. You look beautiful, he said. Ava's face burned. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, so she did the only thing she could. She looked away. Let's just get this over with, she muttered, stepping past him before he could see just how flustered she was. She could feel him watching her. Then, in a low voice, he said, You have no idea what you're walking into, do you? Ava turned, confused. What do you mean? Nate just smirked. You'll see. The moment they arrived, Ava knew she was in trouble. The gala was held at a lavish estate, the kind of place she had only ever seen in movies. A grand staircase led up to towering doors, the glow of chandeliers spilling out onto the marble steps. And inside, it was another world. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns that probably cost more than her entire apartment lease. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne, and the soft hum of an orchestra played in the background. Ava immediately regretted saying yes. What am I doing here? She muttered under her breath. Nate, who had been watching her reaction with amusement, leaned in slightly. Relax. You belong here just as much as anyone else. She gave him a skeptical look. I sincerely doubt that. Before he could argue, a new voice cut in. Nathaniel. Ava turned to see a stunning woman approaching, tall, poised, the kind of elegant that was effortless. Nate's jaw tightened. Mother. Ava's stomach dropped. This was his mother? Victoria Hayes barely spared her a glance before focusing on her son. I was beginning to think you wouldn't show up. I told you I'd be here, Nate said coolly. Her sharp eyes flickered to Ava then, assessing her with the kind of look that made it very clear she had already decided Ava wasn't worth her attention. "And you brought a guest," Victoria said, her tone polite but laced with something else. Ava resisted the urge to sink into the floor. Nate's arm brushed against hers, subtle but intentional. "Yes, this is Ava." Victoria didn't smile. "Pleasure, I'm sure." Ava forced a tight nod, gripping her clutch like a lifeline. "Could I have a word, Nathaniel?" Victoria continued, her gaze flickering between them. "Alone?" A muscle ticked in Nate's jaw. Ava immediately stepped back. "It's fine," she said quickly. "I can." "No." Nate's voice was firm. "You're not going anywhere." Ava stilled. He looked at his mother. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Victoria's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Displeasure. After a long pause, she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Very well," she said. "Enjoy your evening, Nathaniel." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of guests. Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "What was that?" she whispered. Nate exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "That," he said, "was a warning." Ava stared at him. "A warning?" He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "She doesn't like things she can't control." Ava swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very much like something that couldn't be controlled. She should have never come here. She didn't belong in this world. And she was beginning to think Nate knew that too. Ava barely touched her champagne. She held the delicate glass in her fingers, swirling the golden liquid absently, but her mind was a million miles away. Across the grand ballroom, Victoria Hayes was laughing politely with a group of high-profile guests, her perfect posture and effortless grace making her look like she belonged in this world, because she did. Ava, on the other hand, did not. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the stares, the murmurs. Who is she? Why is Nathaniel Hayes here with her? She wasn't stupid. She had known from the moment she walked in that she didn't belong. But she didn't belong, but she had convinced herself she could survive one night. That it was just a gala, just a favor to Nate. But after meeting his mother, after seeing the sharp glint in Victoria's eyes when she looked at her, like she was temporary, something inside Ava started to crack. She didn't belong in Nate's world. And more than that, she didn't want to. A hand brushed against hers, startling her. She turned to find Nate watching her carefully, his blue eyes searching. "You're quiet," he said. Ava forced a small smile. "I'm just taking it all in." He frowned slightly, clearly unconvinced. Then, before he could press her further, another voice cut in. Nathaniel. A man, tall, sharply dressed, his presence just as commanding as Victoria's, approached them. Ava recognized him instantly from the articles she had read. Robert Hayes, Nate's father. Ava felt the tension roll off Nate's shoulders like a storm cloud. "Dad," he greeted, his voice clipped. Robert's gaze barely lingered on Ava before shifting back to his son. "Your mother tells me you're still refusing to consider taking a leadership role at Hayes Medical." Ava tensed. "Oh." Nate's jaw tightened. "That's not happening." Robert exhaled, shaking his head in disappointment. "Nathaniel, you're wasting your potential. Running a billion-dollar medical empire does a lot more good than treating one patient at a time." Ava swallowed hard. This was not a conversation she should be standing in the middle of. But Nate didn't even flinch. "I'm doctor. That's what I chose." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. "You chose it out of rebellion. You never wanted to follow in my footsteps, and I allowed it. But it's time to stop playing doctor and start thinking about your future. Ava saw the way Nate's fingers curl into a fist at his side. You don't get to decide my future, Nate said coolly. Robert's eyes flickered, and for the first time, his attention shifted fully to Ava. And what about you? He asked, his tone even. Are you part of his future? Ava's breath caught in her throat. She felt Nate stiffen beside her, but before he could say anything, Robert continued. My wife seems to think you won't last, he said. And my wife is rarely wrong. Ava's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. She had expected this. She had known, deep down, that people like Victoria and Robert Hayes would never see her as someone who belonged in their world. But hearing it spoken out loud, so bluntly, so certain, still hurt. Nate took a sharp step forward. That's enough. Robert barely blinked. Is it? Ava felt sick. She needed to leave. I need some air, she said suddenly, stepping back before Nate could stop her. She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked away. The cool night air hit Ava like a wave as she stepped onto the quiet terrace. She gripped the railing, inhaling deeply, trying to calm the storm inside her. What was she even doing here? Nate's world was filled with power and expectation. He belonged to charity galas and in boardrooms, in places where people knew his name before he even introduced himself. And she was just Ava, a girl who worked in a bookstore, a girl who had spent her life avoiding attention, avoiding risks, avoiding getting hurt. This thing between them, whatever it was never going to last. She should walk away now, before it was too late. Before she got too attached. Before she started believing Nate would actually fight for her. Ava. She flinched at the sound of his voice. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his tie slightly loosened, his brows drawn together in concern. You just left, he said. I needed air, she murmured. Nate studied her carefully. What did my father say to you? Ava shook her head. It doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Her heart twisted. God, why did he have to look at her like that? Like she was something worth fighting for. She exhaled shakily. Nate, this isn't my world. He frowned. So... She let out a small, breathless laugh. So your mother just looked at me like I was a mistake. And your father practically told me to my face that I won't last. And the worst part? They're right. Nate's expression darkened. No, they're not. Ava swallowed hard. Nate. No, his voice was firm. You don't get to decide that. She blinked. Excuse me? You don't get to decide that you're not good enough for me, he said. That's not your choice to make. Her chest ached. I'm just trying to be realistic. So am I, Nate countered. And realistically, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day you walked into my office. Ava's breath stalled. I don't care what my parents think, he said, stepping closer. I don't care what anyone in that room thinks. The only thing I care about, he exhaled sharply, is you. Ava's hands trembled, and for the first time, she felt terrified. Because if she let herself believe him, if she let herself fall, she wasn't sure she'd survive it. Ava sat at the small table in her apartment, staring blankly at the ultrasound report in her hands.
She was fine.
The lump wasn't dangerous. Her doctor, Nate, had told her that multiple times. And yet she still found herself gripping the edges of the paper like it might suddenly rewrite itself into something worse. Because the truth was, the fear hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted. Before, she'd been terrified of what the test results would reveal. Now, she was terrified of something even more unpredictable. Him. Nate had stood on that terrace, looked her in the eyes, and told her that she mattered, that he wasn't going anywhere. And she had run, because that was the only thing she knew how to do. A sharp knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Ava frowned. It was late. Too late for visitors. She hesitated before standing, her pulse already picking up speed as she approached the door. The moment she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Nate. Nate. Standing there in the dim glow of the hallway light, his blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart pound. Neither of them spoke at first. Then, in a voice quieter than she had ever heard from him, he said, "You weren't going to call me, were you?" Ava's throat tightened. She didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Nate exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. He looked different. Not angry. Not frustrated. Just tired. "You got the results," he said. It wasn't a question. Ava swallowed hard. "Yeah." His jaw tensed. "And?" She hesitated. "It's benign." Relief flickered across his face, but it didn't last long. "Then why do you still look like you're about to run?" he asked, voice lower now. Ava's fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. "Because I'm scared," she admitted. Nate was silent for a long moment. Then he took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "Of what?" She let out a shaky breath. His expression flickered, hurt then something else. Something stubborn. "Ava," he said, his voice quieter now, "I told you." "I know," she cut in, her chest tightening. "I know what you said, Nate. But your world, it's not just different from mine. She shook her head. "I don't belong in it." His eyes darkened.
Who told you that? My mother? My father?
Ava didn't answer. Nate exhaled, his jaw clenching. "You think this is about my world?" he said, his voice rougher now. "You think any of that matters to me?" She squeezed her eyes shut. "It matters to me." Silence stretched between them. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, he said, "Why do you keep pushing me away?" Ava's breath caught. She had no answer. Because the truth, the awful, terrifying truth, was that she wasn't pushing him away because of his family, or his money, or the world he came from. She was pushing him away because if she let herself love him and lost him, she didn't know if she'd survive it. Nate must have seen something in her face because his expression shifted. He inhaled deeply, then, in a voice laced with quiet frustration, said, "You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met." Ava blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" But before she could say another word, he closed the distance between them completely. And then he kissed her. Not gently, not cautiously. It was a kiss that demanded answers, that refused to let her run. His hands slid up, framing her face, his touch warm, steady, grounding her when she felt like she was about to fall apart. Ava's heart stopped, then raced, her fingers gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She had spent weeks convincing herself this was nothing, that it would fade. But this was real. And she was terrified of it. Because she knew deep down there was no going back from this. When Nate finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. His voice was a whisper. "Tell me to leave." Ava's pulse roared in her ears. Tell him to leave. Tell him this was a mistake. Tell him he was right. She was the most infuriating woman in the world because she didn't know how to let herself be loved. Her lips parted, and then, instead of telling him to leave, she whispered, "Stay." Nate exhaled, relief flickering across his face. And then, just like that, the walls she had spent years building came crashing down. Ava wasn't sure what waking up next to Nate was supposed to feel like. Maybe it should have felt foreign, terrifying, like stepping into something too big, too real. But as sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains of her apartment, casting soft golden light across the sheets, all she felt was peace, warmth. His arm was still draped around her waist, his breath slow and steady against the back of her neck. She barely dared to move, afraid of disturbing the quiet moment, afraid of how much she already wanted more of it. Her fingers brushed against the sheets as she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying everything that had led to this. The fight. The way he had looked at her, like he wasn't going to let her run this time. The kiss. The way she had whispered, "Stay," and meant it with every fiber of her being. And now, here they were. A soft murmur broke through her thoughts, and she felt Nate shift behind her. His grip around her waist tightened slightly, as if he already knew she was awake. Then, in a voice still thick with sleep, he murmured, "I knew you'd overthink the second you woke up." Ava froze. Then, mortified, she twisted to face him. "I am not overthinking." Nate opened one eye, the corner of his mouth tugging up in that annoyingly knowing smirk. She scowled. "I'm just processing." His smirk widened. "And how's that going for you?" Ava wanted to wipe the amusement off his face, but she was too busy trying to breathe, because now that she was actually looking at him, really looking, her brain short-circuited. God.
How did someone look that good in the morning?
His hair was slightly messy, his blue eyes softer than usual, his bare chest inches from where she lay. And worse, he knew exactly what he was doing to her. "Stop looking at me like that," she muttered. Nate chuckled, his voice still rough from sleep. "Like what?" "Like you know things." He raised an eyebrow. "I do know things." Ava groaned, shoving the pillow over her face. "I regret everything." Nate just laughed, actually laughed, before effortlessly pulling the pillow away and tossing it aside. "Too late for that," he murmured, his gaze flickering to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "You already let me in." Her breath hitched. Because he was right. She had spent weeks, months, building walls, convincing herself that whatever was happening between them was temporary, that it would fade, that she could walk away before it hurt. But then Nate had kissed her. And now, here they were. And Ava had never felt safer. She swallowed hard. "This is real, isn't it?" Nate's expression softened. "Yeah." That one word, simple, sure, settled something deep in her chest. She wasn't used to certainty. She wasn't used to staying. But maybe she could learn. Nate studied her for a moment, then lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I meant what I said last night," he murmured. Ava's pulse stuttered.
Which part?
His thumb traced absent circles against her cheek. "The part where I told you I wasn't going anywhere." She inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the sheets.
Even if I freak out again?
"Even then." Her throat tightened. "Even if your mother hates me?" Nate's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "She'll deal with it." Ava bit her lip. "Even if—" Nate kissed her before she could finish. It was slow, certain, stealing whatever argument she had left. And when he finally pulled away, his voice was a whisper against her lips. "Even if you try to run again," he said, "I'll still be right here." Ava's heart nearly broke in half. Because no one had ever stayed for her before. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to believe that Nate would. The hospital lobby buzzed with life. Doctors rushing between appointments, nurses checking charts, patients waiting with nervous anticipation. But for Ava, standing just inside the glass entrance, everything felt different. A year ago, she had walked into this hospital with fear lodged so deeply in her chest that she could barely breathe. She had been terrified of what the test would reveal, terrified of the way one doctor in particular made her feel. And now, she was here with him, not as a patient, not as someone afraid of the future, but as someone who had chosen to stay. Fingers brushed against hers, warm and familiar. She glanced up to find Nate watching her, his usual knowing smirk, softened into something gentler, something unmistakably real. "You okay?" he asked, squeezing her hand. Ava exhaled, smiling. Yeah, it had taken time. More time than she liked to admit, for her to accept that this wasn't temporary. That Nate wasn't going to wake up one day and decide that she didn't belong in his world. Because, as he had reminded her countless times, his world was wherever she was. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's do this." Together, hand in hand, they stepped further inside. 6 months ago, Nate had come to her with an idea. "I want to launch a program for accessible breast cancer screenings," he had told her one night, his voice filled with a quiet determination, for women who can't afford it. Women who put it off because they're scared, because they don't think it matters until it's too late. Ava had immediately understood, because she had been one of those women. So they had worked. Late nights, early mornings, meetings with sponsors and doctors who believed in the same cause. And today, the first phase of the Hayes Sinclair Foundation was officially launching. Nate led her toward a small press conference set up near the entrance, hospital executives already gathering. But before they reached them, he pulled her to a stop. She turned, confused, until she saw the look in his eyes. Nate, I need to do this first," he said, almost grinning now. Ava blinked. "Do what?" And then, he dropped to one knee. Ava's breath stopped. The entire room seemed to fade, the background noise dulling into nothing. All she could see was him, Nate. The man who had fought for her even when she ran. The man who had met every one of her fears with unwavering patience. The man who had never once let her believe she was anything less than his future. His smile was steady, unchanging. "I was going to do this tonight," he admitted, flipping open the small velvet box in his hand. Somewhere fancy, with champagne, candlelight, the whole thing. Ava couldn't breathe. "But then I realized," he continued, "that none of that matters." She could feel her heart breaking open, because she knew what was coming next. "All that matters," he murmured, "is you." Ava let out a shaky laugh, barely holding it together. "Nate, I love you," he said firmly, "certainly forever. And I'm going to keep loving you. Every version of you. The one who overthinks, the one who runs, the one who runs, the one who somehow still can't look me in the eye when she's flustered." Her chest ached. "So," he said, his blue eyes never leaving hers, "let me love you forever, Ava Sinclair." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Marry me." Her entire body felt like it was on fire. And then she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. Nate's grin lit up the entire world. He stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into his arms as the entire lobby burst into cheers. Ava barely noticed, because the only thing that mattered was this: him, them, and the future that, for the first time, didn't scare her at all. Life has a way of leading us to the places we fear the most, only to show us that those places were meant to shape us, not break us. Ava's journey wasn't just about facing a medical scare or finding love. It was about learning to let go of the fears that had controlled her for so long. She thought she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong in Nate's world, that loving someone meant risking losing them. But love, real love, isn't about fitting into a perfect mold. It's about choosing each other despite the differences, despite the fears, despite the uncertainties. We often tell ourselves that we're not worthy of the happiness knocking at our door, that we should walk away before we get hurt. But the truth is, the best things in life, the ones that change us, heal us, and make us whole, require courage. Ava learned that she was never too small for big love. She was never too ordinary for an extraordinary life. And neither are you. So if there's one thing to take from this story, let it be this: don't run from the things that scare you just because they feel bigger than you. You are more capable, more worthy, and more loved than you realize. What about you? Have you ever let fear hold you back from something meant for you? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more soul stirring, emotional, and inspiring love stories. Where are you watching from? Let us know. We love hearing from our amazing community around the world. See you in the next story.